Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our series here on Political Insider called Integrity. And this is our series about Winston Churchill. And this is episode 2 of Winston Churchill. Last time you'll recall, we looked at his childhood and his early life. So we're going to pick up today with the years 1895 to 1898. And again, the main source that I'm looking at here is Andrew Roberts, Churchill, Walking with Destiny. So Churchill is in 1895 becomes a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars cavalry unit, and he had been assigned to India. Now, during his time as a soldier, he moonlighted as a war correspondent or a correspondent for some of the major newspapers, publications back in England. And within 5 years after taking this job, he was the world's best paid war correspondent. Isn't that amazing? Of all the things this guy did, and he was still the very best at what he did in terms of being a war correspondent. Most of his life, he still faced money issues. That's because they spent a lot. And therefore, he wrote regularly for journalistic sources until 1939. Now, Churchill learned how to write tersely, to speak with clever devices. He studied speech and writing, as did Abraham Lincoln. And he learned that to use every note of the human voice, he said, as if playing an organ. Cadences and phrases were particularly important to him. And he learned from his father a trick, which was to, when you wanted somebody to listen, you stop talking. See how that works? And people would lean in. And he even would learn how to, from his father, play with his keys or play with pocket change as if he was thinking about something when he already knew what he wanted to say, but he was just building anticipation. He visited America, and what you find striking about his visit to America is how much he sounds like Alexis de Tocqueville. He said, quote, "What an extraordinary people the Americans are. Their hospitality is a revelation to me, and they make you feel at home and at ease in a way that I've never before experienced." Of course, he's used to stuffy English lords, right? He says, quote, "This is a very great country, my dear Jack," telling his brother, "not pretty or romantic, but great and utilitarian. There seems to be no such thing as reverence or tradition. Everything is eminently practical and thus is judged from a matter of fact standpoint." He then said, "Picture to yourself the American people as a great lusty youth who treads on all your sensibilities, perpetrates every possible horror of ill manners, whom neither age nor just tradition inspire with reverence, but who moves about his affairs with a good-hearted freshness, which may well be the envy of the older nations of the earth." So it's an interesting description of America. He did think that the United States had its faults, and he thought that acquiring Cuba in the Spanish-American War would be a problem. Churchill said when Spain had Cuba that, quote, "it was like a dumbbell held at arm's length," meaning pretty soon you're just going to have to drop it. You can't hold it up forever. When Churchill finally gets to India, arriving at Bangalore, he said that imperialism was okay. All his life, Churchill would be a thoroughgoing imperialist. He said the 150,000 or so Britons in India could not maintain their Raj, literally the rule, without the active cooperation of vast numbers of the more than 300 million Indians back then. And Churchill understood that this could only be done through maintaining the prestige and power of the rulers. He said, quote, "Nothing is so remarkable as the ascendancy which the British officer maintains over the native soldier. The dark sowars, the cavalrymen from India, follow the young English soldier who commands them with a strange devotion. To save his life, they will sacrifice their own." So tremendous loyalty there of the Indian soldiers. Now he politically starts to look at things in England with an eye toward politics, and he favored, this may shock some of you, a progressive income tax with total exceptions for the poor and the higher rate for unearned than for earned income. And he always had a sense of humor. We're going to see that more and more as we go through his story. Apparently, Churchill did not believe in Jesus. He made a few references to the Almighty or to God, but there's no indication that he ever took seriously Jesus or his divinity. He traveled all over India, writing from Bangalore to the upper Swat Valley, Pune, Timilgiri, the Mahmud Bayar, Hyderabad, Raipur, Meerut, Peshawar, the Bara Valley, Bombay, Uttarakhand, Madras, Jodhpur, and Calcutta. I'd never heard of some of these places. And he talked about visiting these places. He said, quote, "You could lift the boat with your hands. You could lift the heat with your hands. You could lift the heat with your hands. It sat on your shoulders like a knapsack. It rested on your head like a nightmare." Also during this time, Churchill begins to drink, and throughout his life, he will be a very high functioning alcoholic. He can drink a ton and not be too affected. When he gets back to Bangalore, he started to write his first book. Again, he's still a soldier, right? The Story of the Malaccan Field Force, an episode of the Frontier War. And so he adds a book publication to his many article publications. He also begins to work on his speaking, and he claims there are 5 elements to great oratory. First was, quote, "the exact expression of words, that is, the continual employment of the best possible word." And you'll find Churchill is unbelievable for how he finds a remarkably odd word that just is the perfect fit for a situation. He instanced, for example, dour to describe the Scots. He believed in using short, homely words of common usage. But he also looked to having an internal rhythm. The second element of his great speech was sound. The influence of sound on the human brain is well known. He wrote, "The sentences of the orator, when he appeals to his art, become long, rolling, and sonorous. Particular balance of phrases produces a cadence which resembles a blank verse rather than prose." This is something that Abraham Lincoln worked on as well. And I don't know the literary term, but it's when you repeat a certain sound in a phrase. Disrupt, destroy, disavow. I don't know what it is, but you repeat something that has that same sound to the ear, beginning with possibly the same consonant. And this produces that cadence. He also knew Shakespeare well enough to fake Shakespeare and come up with fake Shakespeare phrases that fooled people. A third element of his speech and oratory was a steady accumulation of argument. That is, you start building an argument and it gets bigger and bigger and wider until opposition collapses. Fourth, he used analogy, which can, quote, translate established truth into a simple language. And he would forever be referring back to his family and the Duke of Marlborough and things that the Duke said, things like that. A tendency to wild extravagance of language, to extravagance so wild that it recoils, is evident in most perorations, wrote of the last element. The emotions of the speaker and the listeners are alike aroused with some expression that must be found that will represent all of what they are feeling. So I guess we could say connections. Churchill believed that to be a great speaker, you need to connect, you need to speak about things people cared about, and that you should rouse them to kind of this pitch at the end, which I'm sure if you saw the movie, which is not all that accurate in many ways, A Darkest Hour, but nevertheless gave a good idea of how Churchill spoke. He used deliberately old and outdated words. For example, he wrote his mother in 1898, I end ere, E-R-E, I weary you, adieu. So, who uses err anymore in that way, not to make an error or to err in adding something up, but lest. I end in case I weary you, or unless I weary you, or else I weary you. He often used anachronistic vocabulary to great effect. In many of his cases, he would apply the word foe to an enemy, or use a phrase such as in the olden time. We don't, today we say back in the day. It's extraordinary how many of his greatest Second World War speeches conform to each of the 5 elements of what he saw to be a great speech. On the Indian frontier, he also, for the first time, confronted Islamic people, and he saw Islamic fundamentalism up close as a sort of fanaticism that in many key ways, its contempt for Christianity, its opposition to liberal Western values, its addiction to violence, demand for total allegiance, was like that of the Nazis. And none of the 3 British prime ministers of the 1930s, Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, or Neville Chamberlain, had ever personally encountered Islamic fundamentalists. They had never seen one. And so they were slow to see this kind of crazy extremism in the form of Hitler, because they hadn't seen it in some of these other people. But Churchill had. Now, that ends our second look at Churchill's life. Our next stage, he's going to go with the army to Omdurman, and he takes part in one of the biggest battles of the 1800s, the Battle of Omdurman, and is a part of the only failure or screw up in that whole battle. I mean, the British dominate this battle, just annihilate the enemy. But there's one instance in which they screw up and their cavalry is led into a trap, and Winston Churchill will be a part of those Lancers when they fall into this trap. So we'll take that up next time as we continue on with our series on integrity, Winston Churchill.